Good afternoon, everyone. I suppose this might seem a slightly unusual subject in a way. We do have talks on creation and evolution, but to talk about the blasphemy of evolution, that may seem slightly unusual. But what I hope to show is that for those who adopt a belief in evolution, therefore denying creation, are in effect denying the creator, and that really is blasphemy against the God of heaven, who we believe from the Bible is the creator of all things. So that's what we'd like to briefly do this afternoon. First of all, to show that there is reasonable evidence for creation, and at the same time to demonstrate that actually the evidence for evolution is a flawed evidence base, based, for example, on assumptions that can't be proved. And putting those 2 points together, that leads us to the conclusion that it's actually blasphemous to deny the existence of God and to believe that all the life that we see around us on Earth and the rest of the universe came into existence purely by chance. And that will lead us at the end to our conclusion, to look briefly at some of the moral implications for denying creation, believing in evolution. I remember hearing that quotation from John Humphreys on BBC Radio 4 on the Today programme a little over 10 years ago now. And I was so appalled by it that I wrote it down at the time. He said, "We know evolution is a fact, though there are probably still a few bonkers people out there who don't believe it." Well, I suppose most, if not all of us in this room will have to put our hands up and say, well, we're bonkers, according to John Humphreys. But that's the attitude of most people in the world today, certainly in the Western world in which we live. So we're going to examine what the implications are of adopting that bonkers philosophy, according to the wise and eminent men of our generation. Let's just think first of all about what blasphemy is. Three different definitions, three dictionary definitions, all slightly different, but really they're leading us to the same point. The Concise Oxford English Dictionary says blasphemy is disrespectful talk about God or sacred things. So surely evolution fits into that. If we say that God doesn't exist, that life came into existence purely by chance, that's being disrespectful about God and about things that really are sacred. Columbia Encyclopedia says blasphemy in religion amounts to words or actions that display irreverence towards or contempt of God. And again, we'd say evolution fits into that. To say that God doesn't exist and evolution is correct is showing contempt of the creator. Another definition, a contemptuous or profane act, blasphemy, an utterance or writing concerning God, an irreverent or impious act, attitude or utterance in regard to something considered inviolable or sacred. And once again, we would suggest that evolution, therefore, is blasphemous according to those definitions. So, if we take blasphemy as the basis for our discussion this afternoon, blasphemy against God by evolutionists is only a fact if God exists. In other words, if God doesn't exist, then we can't blaspheme him. That surely is logical. But if God does exist, then to deny his existence and his work as a creator constitutes blasphemy, an act of irreverence against God, contempt of the creator. Now, we can't absolutely prove the existence of God in the sense we can't point to God and say, there he is. But of course, evolution can't be proved either. So both sides of the equation are on equal footing in that regard. But if there's a reasonable evidence for the existence of God, let's underline that word reasonable. If there's a reasonable evidence for the existence of God, then as the creator, then evolution becomes blasphemy because it denies the existence of God, whereas if there is reasonable evidence for his existence, evolution is flying in the face of the evidence. So we're going to test some of the evidence on both sides of the argument, and some of what we put up on the screen, I think you will see, according to the basis that we've tried to set out, constitutes blasphemy of evolution. Richard Dawkins, somebody who's written plenty about evolution. This is a quote from Richard Dawkins' official website, reviewing his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which was published in 1986. This review says, Richard Dawkins' second book refers to the Reverend William Paley's 1802 work, Natural Theology, which argued that just as finding a watch would lead you to conclude that a watchmaker must exist, the complexity of living organisms prove that a creator exists. Not so, says Dawkins. All appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. It is the blind watchmaker. Just note that phrase that I've underlined and put in bold there. Not my words, this is the words of the reviewer of this book, who's approving what he says. All appearances to the contrary. So in other words, don't mind what the evidence suggests, we're going to say something different, absolutely contrary to the evidence. And instead of acknowledging that there has to be a designer in the complexity of nature, says, oh, it all happened by chance. It's the blind watchmaker. So he's proposing a theory which simply runs contrary to the evidence, therefore denies God, and therefore we suggest constitutes blasphemy. So this is the blasphemy of evolution. Another quotation from Richard Dawkins. He wrote, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Again, my emphasis there, those words underlined. He says it gives the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Well, indeed, the complexity of nature does give that appearance, but of course he chooses to deny where the evidence is leading him. Again, ignores the evidence. Again, we suggest it amounts to blasphemy. Another quote from a reviewer of another book by Richard Dawkins called The Selfish Gene. This reviewer says that Richard Dawkins' brilliant reformulation of the theory of natural selection has the rare distinction of having provoked as much excitement and interest outside the scientific community as within it. That struck me as being a significant statement, simply because the reviewer talks about a reformulation of the theory of natural selection. There's an acknowledgement that this is still a theory, not something that can be demonstrated as fact. So clearly, on the basis of what these people say, there is no settled theory of natural selection, which is the basis, of course, of evolution. It's still a theory, still under development, because Richard Dawkins has come up with a, quote, brilliant reformulation of the theory. Well, it's dishonest, isn't it, to suggest that it's anything but a theory. So, the blasphemy of denying a designer. Blind watchmaker defies logic and evidence. And just imagine a similar situation. Imagine a child asserting that its parents were not responsible for it coming into existence, for it being created. I mean, that would be absolute and utter nonsense and highly offensive to the parents. So how offensive and blasphemous must the attitude of the evolutionists be to God, the almighty creator of the heavens and the earth, when man in his arrogance suggests, oh, these things just came into existence by chance. There is no such thing as a creator and a designer. If you still get your Bibles open in the Psalms, just turn back a couple of pages to Psalm 14 and see what the Bible has to say about those who choose to deny the existence of God, the Creator. Psalm 14, verse 1, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They've done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone aside. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good. No, not one. The language is blunt, to say the least, is it not? It's very uncompromising in its attitude to those who deny the existence of God. They're corrupt, abominable, they're not doing good, they're filthy. There's not one of them that does good. And that is the attitude of the majority of people, eminent people, scientists in our world today. And the Bible says they're fools. So there's really no compromise between the two sides of the equation. The Bible says, deny the existence of God and you're a fool. The evolutionist said there isn't such a thing as God. These things that we see around us might have the appearance of being designed, but actually they came into existence by chance. Here's another eminent, if that's the right word to use, evolutionist of modern times, Stephen Hawking. The whole history of science has been the gradual realization that events do not happen in an arbitrary manner, but that they reflect a certain underlying order, which may or may not be divinely inspired. Now, that's quite an admission from somebody who propounds the theory of evolution. He seems unable to bring himself to outrightly deny the existence of God, to deny the existence of design in the world around us. He acknowledges that the things we see reflect a certain underlying order. But he says may or may not be divinely inspired. It's interesting, I think, because that seems to show to me that there is a sort of inherent doubt in the minds of some people who propound the theory of evolution, but actually can see the other side of the argument as well. There's another eminent scientist, may or may not be significant, that he also happened to be a Jew. He said, the more I study science, the more I believe in God. In other words, the more he looked at the evidence, the more convinced he was that there is a God who created these things, who designed the living world. That is an honest appraisal of the evidence, accepting where it leads him, instead of saying, well, whatever the appearance of things, I'm going to believe something else. That isn't blasphemous. That's an acknowledgement of the greatness of God, instead of acting in an irreverent way towards the Creator. Just think about some of the evidence for creation and design. Human reproduction. Conception occurs when a sperm fertilizes an egg or the ovum. And the ovum in the womb of the female is 120 microns in diameter. A micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter. So that egg is tiny, invisible to the human eye. The head of the sperm is 5 microns times 3 microns, with a tail 41 microns long, equally microscopic. And yet put those two together and the combined cell contains all the data needed to form a complete human body, living human body, and the personality into which that child will develop, all contained in that microscopic cell. And the Bible recognized that miracle, because it is a miracle. Ecclesiastes chapter 11. There's one verse which, written by the wise man who penned Ecclesiastes under the inspiration of the Spirit, demonstrates the humility, not blasphemy, the humility of someone who recognized the truth of these things. Verse 5 of Ecclesiastes 11, as thou knowest not what is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child, even so thou knowest not the works of God, who maketh all. That's an indication of the sort of humility that we should have when we approach the Bible and God and these things that we're speaking about this afternoon. It's a quotation, slightly long quotation, but I think it's worth reading. It's taken from a book called Why Us? How Science Rediscovered the Mystery of Ourselves by a medical doctor, James Lefanu. He does write in the media sometimes. It's a book that I can well recommend. Basically, what he's arguing in this book is when you look at man and the human being and all its unique features, why are we so different? Why are we so special? Surely it's evidence for a creator. He says the sun, for all the warmth and energy and beauty with which it suffuses our lives, is a trivial fact when set against the human brain. Certainly that's the sun's size, 99% of the matter of our solar system, its core temperature of 26,000 degrees centigrade, and its estimated lifespan of 10,000 million years is impressive enough. But it is no more than a massive exercise in nuclear fusion, converting every second 700 million tons of hydrogen into 695 million tons of helium and 5 million tons of heat and energy in the form of gamma rays, which traverse 93 million miles of space to initiate the great cycle of life here on Earth. That's pretty much all it does. By contrast, the human brain is so deep and talented as to defy the most thorough exposition of its attributes. What are some of those attributes? Well, the decade from 2000 to 2010 was earmarked as the decade of the brain. And using PET scanners, positive positron emission tomography, to produce 3D images, scientists have been able to discover, among other things, the memory is not deposited in one single part of the brain. Various elements of memory regarding people, events, and so forth are held in different parts of the brain and recombined almost instantaneously when a memory is recalled. Although sadly sometimes not quite as instantaneously as we would like, but anyway, that's a different story. Elements of memory are reallocated to different parts of the brain depending on how often they are recalled. See, it's working dynamically all the time to be efficient. But that last paragraph is absolutely mind-blowing. The human brain has an estimated 100 billion cells, each one with 10,000 interconnections. The result is 1,000 trillion synaptic connections within the human brain. That is mind-boggling, I would suggest. And to even consider that it might have come about by chance really, frankly, beggars belief. And to suggest it is blasphemy against the Creator. About the variety in nature, animals, plants, and so on. If natural selection is correct, surely evolution should be logically working towards an optimal model for life instead of retaining all the variety that we have. I find it slightly ironic that a lot of scientists and people interested in ecology today are believers in evolution, but they also want to preserve all the biodiversity that we find. Well, that's slightly contradictory points of view, but they don't seem to acknowledge that. That variety gives us pleasure. We look at plants, for example, flowers. Pleasure is an emotion. But if evolution is correct, then the world around us is purely mechanistic, and emotion should have no part in it. But we all understand emotion, whether it's listening to music or looking at something beautiful. And so that in itself is contrary to evolution. The silent evidence of creation. Well, that comes back to that psalm that we read by way of introduction. Psalm 19, the opening verses of that psalm. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There's no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line is gone out through all the earth. Their words to the end of the world. In them he set a tabernacle for the sun, and so on. Now, of course, the heavenly bodies don't say anything. We don't hear anything from the heavenly bodies. We can see them. We can study them through telescopes and so on, but their witness is silent. And yet the evidence that they present to us is overwhelming. I'm just going to read a verse of one of the hymns from a hymn book. It's based on Psalm 19, and it's actually a quotation from a poem written by a man called Joseph Addison in the 18th century. And it's based on those opening verses of Psalm 19. Just listen carefully to these words. What though in solemn silence all move round this dark terrestrial ball? What though no real voice nor sound amidst their radiant orbs be found? In reason's ear they all rejoice and utter forth a glorious voice, forever singing as they shine. The hand that made us is divine. I think those are very powerful words and a very apt rendering, really, of the meaning behind those opening words of Psalm 19. The evidence of creation is silent, and yet when you approach it logically and reasonably, it speaks louder than anything that there is a creator who made these things. What about the flawed evidence base for evolution? I'm not going to go into any great detail about radiometric dating. It gets quite technical, and I'm certainly not an expert in these things. I have a couple more slides that I won't be showing at the end of this if anybody wants to look at a bit more detail. But the evolutionists would say, well, this tells us that the Earth is extremely old. Some authorities quote a figure of 4.6 billion years, but that might vary by the odd billion here or there, depending on which authority you look at. But actually, that's based on flawed and unprovable assumptions. Underline that word, assumptions, which are most likely incorrect and which discredit the methodology. The quotation from Wikipedia on radiometric dating. Many of the ages derived by radiometric dating techniques are highly publicized. Nevertheless, the fundamental assumptions employed are not. See the acknowledgement there that there is a technique here that's based on assumptions, but people don't discuss the assumptions. And he goes on, there are three major assumptions. Now, I'm not going to go through those in detail, but that last sentence there is quite significant, because this section of this article concludes on the basis of those assumptions. If you assume they're all true, and you're trying to calculate the age of a piece of rock, the rock would have a superficial appearance of age based on assumptions, three of them, fundamental assumptions, which are unprovable. About the Big Bang. When powerful telescopes like the Hubble telescope were put into orbit around the Earth, scientists discovered what appears to be an expanding universe. Hence the Big Bang theory, that at some point in the distant past there was a huge explosion, and all the parts of this explosion were blasted out into the infinity of space, resulting in planets, stars, and so forth. And they're still expanding. The results of that explosion are still going on. And yet that respected scientist, Sir Isaac Newton, in the 18th century, in one of his great scientific works, the Principia, proposed a model of a stable universe. Just as a matter of interest, Isaac Newton wrote more words on the Bible than he did on science. But that's not very often discussed either. Now, satellites and space exploration, sending man to the moon or spaceships to Mars and so on, depend on the absolutely stable and predictable movement of the planets and the heavenly bodies. Otherwise, the appropriate calculations couldn't be made. Now, Newton's model is, of course, exactly in line with the Bible. Come to Jeremiah chapter 33. He believed in a stable universe and wrote about it. Jeremiah chapter 33. verse 19. The word of the Lord came unto Jeremiah, saying, Thus saith the Lord, if ye can break my covenant of the day and my covenant of the night, and that there should not be day and night in their season, then may also my covenant be broken with David my servant, that he should not have a son to reign upon his throne, and with the Levites, the priests, my ministers. As the host of heaven cannot be numbered, neither the sand of the sea measured, so will I multiply the seed of David my servant and the Levites that minister unto me. Verse 25. Thus saith the Lord, if my covenant be not with day and night, and if I have not appointed the ordinances of heaven and earth, then will I cast away the seed of David and David my servant, so that I will not take any of his seed to be rulers over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for I will cause their captivity to return and have mercy on them. First of all, the prophet is saying, and he's speaking the words of God himself, I've established the heavenly bodies. I've established them by a covenant or a decree. They're predictable. They control day and night. Even though you can't number the number of the stars, they control affairs on earth. And then the prophet says that's all connected with God's plan with the nation of Israel. Just as those things in heaven and earth are stable and predictable, so my purpose, God says through Jeremiah, with the nation of Israel is stable and predictable. And my promises with regard to Israel will not fail. Just remember that, the link between the stability of creation and God's purpose with the nation of Israel, because that is one of the central messages of the Bible. The arrogance of the evolutionist who blasphemes God. Job chapter 38. The evolutionist tells us that the earth is 4.6 billion years old, or whatever massive figure they come up with. What does the Bible say? Well, we know what it says in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And according to the chronology of the Bible, that was about 6,000 years ago. Job 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? In other words, God says to Job, were you there at creation? Do you know what happened then? What right have you to challenge my record of creation? Do you know better than me? Chapter 40 and verse 2. Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. In other words, you dare to argue with God? Are you capable of teaching God, of instructing him? Well, these are, what's the term, rhetorical questions. The answers doesn't need to be given. Of course, we weren't there at creation. Of course, the evolutionist wasn't there at creation. We have to accept the evidence and the record that God has given. The Bible tells us how great the Creator is. Isaiah chapter 44 and verse 6, first of all. Thus saith the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first and I am the last, and beside me there is no God. He is unique. He says, there is no other God. I know not any. The next chapter, chapter 45, verse 11. Thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and his Maker, Ask me of things to come concerning my sons, and concerning the work of my hands, command ye me. I have made the earth and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their host have I commanded. In other words, God's saying, there's no such thing as a Big Bang. I created the heavens. I stretched them out and set everything in order, and through them controlled day and night upon the earth, going back to Jeremiah chapter 33. And notice again the connection with Israel. Thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, who is the creator. So Israel is a central part of the purpose of the creator of all things. Faith. Well, the evolutionists might say, oh, you need faith to believe in God and to believe in creation, which is true. But you also need faith to believe in evolution. But of course, faith isn't a scientific word. But evolution can't be demonstrated. You can't go into a laboratory and produce an experiment that shows evolution in operation. It's very convenient to have these vast timescales, because then, of course, you can't demonstrate it in operation within the limited time span of one human life. Evolution, I would suggest, requires rather more faith than believing in God as the creator. But at least the Bible believer is honest about faith and says, yes, I do need faith. And the Bible asks me to have faith. Keep a finger in Isaiah if you're there, because we're going to come back to there in a moment. And come over to Hebrews chapter 11, just one verse in Hebrews chapter 11, a core verse about faith. Hebrews 11 and verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him, that's please God. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, in other words, must believe that God exists, and that he, God, is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. So the Bible is absolutely open and upfront about this. Yes, we must have faith. We must believe in the existence of God. And more than that, we must believe that he has a purpose, that he is prepared to offer a reward to those who are prepared to worship him and seek to understand his purpose. And unless we have faith, we cannot please God. Now come back to Isaiah chapter 45 again, but this time to verse 18. Remember, Hebrews 11 said we must have faith and believe that God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Isaiah 45 verse 18, for thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it, he created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. He created the heavens and the earth with a purpose, that it should be inhabited. If the kingdom of God is set up on earth, it will be inhabited by those who have pleased him by having faith and diligently seeking him. Go down to verse 23. God says, I've sworn by myself, the word is gone out of my mouth in righteousness and shall not return, that unto me every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear. I would suggest that's perhaps a warning to the evolutionist. Everyone will be made to acknowledge God as the creator in due time, and God has sworn that that will be the case. Convenience of evolution. Well, of course, it's the easy option. If you believe in evolution, you've dispensed with God, and therefore there's no discipline of religion, there's no moral restraint anymore. You don't need to worry about the commands of Scripture. And so belief in evolution appeals to human nature, because it means that we can do what we want. And therefore it's been readily accepted in our world. But there are consequences. Romans chapter 1. And those consequences are to be seen around us in the world in which we live. Picking up at verse 20, Romans chapter 1 and verse 20. Slightly complex verse this, but we'll comment on it after we've read it. Verse 20, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Now what that verse is saying is, the invisible things of him, of God, from that go back to the creation, are visible. They're clearly seen. We can see the world of nature around us, animal, plants, and so on. We can see those things. They're clearly seen. And we understand those things. We are part of that creation. We are part of those things that were made, and we understand that creation. And we understand, by looking at those things, the eternal power of the Godhead, of God who made these things, so that they're without excuse, so that we are without excuse. We can see the created world. We can see the evidence of the Creator, and so we are without excuse, says the inspired apostle. Verse 21. Because that when they knew God, when the evidence was before them, the world in which we live, of course, Paul was speaking in the context of the first century, but it applies equally today. They glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, John Humphreys, any of those others you care to name, they became fools. Changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature, themselves, more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. You see, in those verses, a brief description of the development of the evolutionist theory. They think they're wise. They change the glory of God into the image of corruptible things. They propose that we evolved from primitive creatures. And the result is God has given men over to uncleanness and to a lie. And so you get then a description of the moral corruption which we see in the world around us. Verse 26. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another. Men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet. And we recognize, do we not, the standards, the low moral standards of the society in which we live. And it's come about because men have abandoned the word of God and divine standards of morality and behavior, and have decided their own standard, and the world is descending into moral degeneracy and chaos. So what's our conclusion? Our conclusion is that blasphemy against the Creator is all around us, amongst those who propound evolution, and is a serious matter, because the evidence is that God exists as the Creator and the designer, and to blaspheme the Creator of heaven and earth is surely a serious matter. The advice of the Bible is to believe in God and accept his teaching and his commands. So in conclusion, come back to Psalm 19, please, the psalm that we had as an introductory reading. We've looked at the first section of the psalm, which presents the silent but compelling evidence of the created world, and in particular of the heavenly bodies. Then look how the psalm continues. Verse 7. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. So in other words, you see the evidence. In reason's ear, what did the poem say? In reason's ear, these things rejoice. It's obvious what the logical conclusion of the evidence is. And that leads us to believe in God and to respect his commands. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is thy servant warned, and in keeping of them there is great reward. We need faith. We need to believe in God, to diligently seek him, and to trust in the reward that he has promised to those who serve him faithfully.